Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
What do governments really know about UFOs? What do UFOs have to do with climate change? Are our leaders afraid to tell us the truth, or is there another agenda?
Are they in league with... No, I'm just kidding. Well, hello there, and welcome to the 257th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Ben, and the guy asking those many and varied questions was my co-host and partner in the paranormal, my dad. I meant to say Al Gore, but it was a joke. You know, climate change, Al Gore, get it?
Maybe just take the rest of the evening off.
No, okay, whatever.
Right. But before we introduce our very distinguished guest this evening, it's time for our weekly contest, of course.
All right, so the question from our last show 2 weeks ago was, what was the name of the Shawnee chief whose 18th century curse often gets the blame for weird happenings in the Ohio Valley of the eastern United States?
Frank Jerzyk from Worcester, Massachusetts got the answer first. Chief Cornstalk, whose actual name was Hokalesqua, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, who lived from 1720 to 1777. He got the blame for everything from bad crops that year to the Mothman outbreak of the 1960s that we frequently talk about on the show.
Right, so this week's question is, in what year did a UFO supposedly crash in a Texas town with the pilot dying and being buried in a local cemetery? Okay, so if you got that right, win a copy of Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species by tonight's guest. So call us locally at 401-766-1240 or nationally at 800-449-1240. If nobody gets an answer before the end of the show and you still think you have a shot, drop a line to me at ben@behindtheparanormal.com.
Tonight we are privileged to have with us again the distinguished author, statesman, and speaker, the Honorable Paul, making you a judge here, the Honorable Paul T. Hellyer. Mr. Hellyer has enjoyed one of the longest and most varied political careers in Canadian history. In 1949, he became the youngest person to that point ever elected to the Canadian Parliament. He lost his seat in the election of 1957, but returned to Parliament the following year. In 1963, he became Minister of National Defence in the Liberal government of Prime Minister Lester Pearson. A native of Ontario, Mr. Hellyer served at a time of great change in Canada, from the controversial adoption of the new maple leaf flag in 1965 to the contentious unification of the Canadian Army, Navy, and Air Force into a combined service in 1968. Mr. Hellyer might have become Prime Minister in 1968, but lost out during the Liberal Party convention to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He was the senior minister in Trudeau's cabinet and continued to serve in the Parliament until 1974. Mr. Hellyer has been something of a gadfly in Canadian politics ever since, being an outspoken opponent of globalization and against the militarization of outer space. Mr. Hellyer has been interested in UFOs since the 1960s, but it was in 2005 that he publicly came forward as a believer in extraterrestrials, not only as visitors, but as movers and shakers in human history. He has become an outspoken advocate for UFO disclosure globally. He is the author of a number of books on public affairs. In 2008, he won the Paradigm Research Group's Award for Political Courage. His website, www.paulhellierweb.com. Hellyer is Hellyer, paulhellierweb.com.
Mr. Hellyer, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal.
It's a real pleasure to be back.
All right, so we started our conversation on the CBS radio edition of our show a few weeks ago, but I'd like to review some of the basic questions because this is a different live audience. So, Mr. Hellyer, forgive us if we repeat ourselves a little this evening. All right, so when did you first come to believe in an extraterrestrial presence on Earth?
Well, if you're talking about really believing to the point where I would say so publicly, not until 2005. That was my turning point when I went from, I guess, agnostic, somebody who thought that they might be real or might not be real, but I didn't know. And during the course of that year, I made a firm decision that they were in fact real. I had watched ABC's 2-hour special, and as somebody said the other night, of course they have the debunkers right at the end, but I wasn't really listening to the debunkers. I was listening to the former policemen and airline pilots and military men who said that they had had personal experience with UFOs, seen them flying along their wingtips and all of that sort of thing. And to me, I knew that they weren't lying. At least that was my conclusion. But it was in the summer of 2005 that I really decided that they were real. I had a friend, Pierre Junot, in Montreal, a young French-speaking Canadian, perfectly bilingual, who for some reason thought that I would be a good person to get interested in the subject. And he kept sending me all sorts of papers, documents of all kinds. And I was honest with him because basically I try to be an honest person. I told him I didn't have time to read them. But he kept sending them, and he was very patient. And he sent me a book called The Day After Roswell by Colonel Philip Corso, former United States intelligence officer. I said, that looks interesting. I'll have to read that sometime. But I, again, didn't have time, but intended to take it on a holiday with me the next summer. Couldn't find it. And then in 2005, when I was looking for another book, couldn't find it. There, lo and behold, it's The Day After Roswell Stirring in Space. The base. So I just took it with me and to the place in the Lake District north of Toronto, from which I'm speaking at this moment, and started to read it. And I found it intriguing. I, at one point, said to myself, is it possible that this is some kind of fiction? I don't read much fiction, but the previous year I had read a book called The Light and Pie. I understand they're just making a movie of it. At the present time, it'll be out in a year or so. And I really didn't know until the end. Maybe I was a little dense, but other people have said they got the same reaction. Really didn't know until the end whether it was fiction or not. But in this case, I recognized the names of the generals and the bases, military bases, from my days in the National Defense Department. So I was sitting reading one day, and my nephew Philip came along and said, what are you reading? I told him. And he said, well, I'm a skeptic. I said, well, it's a free country. You can be a skeptic if you want to. So he went home, and a couple of days later, he phoned and said, I talked to the general, told him what you were reading, and he said, every word is true and more. Where can I get a copy of the book? So I told him. By this time I had finished the book and was completely convinced of its authenticity. Strangely enough, or serendipitous enough, I had been invited to speak to a convocation in Toronto at the university in September. I had absolutely no idea, no thought of accepting the invitation because ufology was not my prime interest or subject. But after reading the book, I was so convinced that there were so many major issues that really had to be discussed by the people of the United States and the people of the world that somebody had to speak out. So I decided that I would, and but only after I had phoned the general. I had met him a couple of years earlier at an aviation show place, and so my nephew gave me his number and gave him a heads up that I'd be calling, which I did, and he started the conversation the same way. He said, every word is true and more. And he spent 20 minutes telling me the more, or some of it, as much as he could without breaking his oath, and said that it included face-to-face talks between officials of the United States and visitors from other planets. And with that assurance, I decided to go public, so I went to the convocation and spoke, and was the last speaker on the agenda because I was so busy scribbling my notes. I should add there was one more little complication. I was getting remarried the following week. I had been married to my late wife for 59 years, and she had died the previous year. And I had asked the widow of my best friend if she would marry me, and she said yes. So I phoned her for permission. I think she was a little bit reluctant about it. She certainly would have been if she'd known how it was going to work out. But she allowed me to go ahead.
What did your best friend have to say about this?
Well, my best friend was dead by then.
Oh,
She had been a widow for
couldn't restrain the question.
For 11 years, I guess. And so I decided to do it, and I said that airplanes were, at least that UFOs were as real as airplanes flying overhead. And I meant it, and I believed it. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't believe it. Didn't believe it totally, and I certainly believe it even more so today when I first know a lot more about the subject than I did then, because I consider I was probably in kindergarten in 2005, maybe 3, 4, or 5 now.
Okay. Now, may we just interrupt the questioning for a moment? We have someone who has attempted to answer our question. If you'd just bear with us for a moment, Mr. Hellyer. This is someone has called in and suggested that the answer to the question, which was in what year did a UFO supposedly crash in Texas, the pilot being killed and buried in the local cemetery, supposedly. He's giving the answer 1896. Actually, we're probably going to get in trouble with the rest of the listeners, but should we give it to him? He's 1 year off.
1 year off? It's not the right answer, though.
Well, I think we just gave people a 50-50 chance of getting...
Yeah, well, he's 1 year off, so I don't know.
All right, well, actually, it was 1897, but Douglas Berger, I guess you're from the local area here, we're going to give that to you. Right. So we'll see that you get a copy of Mr. Hellyer's book. If the producer would be prevailed upon to get your mailing address, we will send her your present. And I think that's 1896 is good. Out of all the years in human history, that's not a bad answer. So really 1897, but we'll give it to you. Okay, thank you very much. Congratulations, Douglas. Now, Mr. Hellyer, I guess Ben wanted to continue with some more questions here.
Okay, so... Oh, okay, we skipped after that. So you have a long and distinguished career in Canadian politics. When did you go public on UFOs, and what was the public's reaction?
Well, he answered that, but I'm curious about the public's reaction.
Yeah,
in
public
05.
Reaction.
September of 2005.
Okay.
The reaction of the mainline press, as you might guess, was silence.
Mm-hmm.
It was very interesting that they had run articles saying that I was going to be speaking at this thing that put on by Victor Vigiani and Mike Bird, who were heads of the Exopolitics Institute of Canada. And so there had been 2 or 3 articles in the paper saying that I was going to do it. But then after I spoke, there wasn't a word. And I think actually we've come quite a long way since then, because there's a lot more in the mainline press today than there was then. And you had Larry King on CNN and interviewing people about the subject. There have been quite a few articles, and a number of people had a press conference in Washington not too many months ago.
Yeah.
They got quite a bit of mainline press. So I think we've made a little bit of progress in 5 years, but nowhere near the progress we should make, because what we're talking about here is one of the most important issues facing the world today. And the American people have absolutely no idea how much money they have spent back engineering the technology that they obtained from crashed UFOs, and what it means. And if they knew, I think they would find it mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling to even speculate how far along they have come in 60 years or more.
Exactly.
But the amount of money would be equally mind-boggling. And I think it's kind of interesting down there having this big squabble about increasing the debt limit by a certain deadline in August. And it would be interesting to know how much of that debt is directly due to what they call the black operations that have been going on in 2 or 3 of your western states for years, decades, actually.
Good question.
Yeah. Well, have you ever talked to any other politicians from around the world about this?
See now, yes, I guess I have, but not in the sense maybe that you mean it, not serious talks with former cabinet ministers and that sort of thing.
Well, no, I mean like off the record.
Yeah, well, and know, a little bit of chit-chat, but ask the odd person how much they knew about what was going on, and the answer was usually not much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just interject here to give our phone numbers again. We often don't do that because we get involved in our conversations. We don't tell people where to call. And we probably have a lot of Canadian listeners. We do have a lot of Canadian listeners, but very often they listen to the podcast rather than live. Anyway, the number locally here in our part of New England and also outside of the United States would be 401 766-1240, 766-1240, or in the United States, 800-449-1240, 1240, if you'd like to speak with us or Mr. Hellyer this evening. So I just may I interject a question here, Ben, if I may?
Well, I guess we were done with that question. So
okay, good.
Go nuts.
No, I just one thing you said, Mr. Hellyer, was of great interest to me certainly, and I'm sure to the audience. You mentioned when you spoke with the general, when you met him in person, in reference to Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, he said there was, you talked about the more, what was in the book. Can you tell us about the more?
Well, what I said earlier was that that there had been face-to-face meetings.
Oh, that was the more, okay.
Yeah, between the United States officials and visitors from other star systems.
Okay. Well, just to extrapolate a bit on Ben's question, we have a lot of relatives in Canada at two opposite ends of the country. When I mentioned that you were going to be on to our British Columbia cousins, they said, "Huh? What?" But in Nova Scotia, they love you. They love you there.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Our cousins.
I like them too.
Yeah, well, that's it. Well, our cousins in the who were within the shouting distance of the Shag Harbor area. Thought it was great you were going to be on, and they're probably listening right now on their computers. But we have one or two of them were indirect witnesses to the Shag Harbor event, which of course happened in the late 1960s. And I was going to ask you if you had any involvement with that. Of course, let me just, for those who don't know what it is, a UFO landed off in the vicinity of Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, between Shelburne and Halifax, as I understand it, and was submerged. There were, I guess, military divers who were involved, and there was some sort of tracking going on, and the thing apparently moved underwater and then was lost to our site anyway. So were you involved in that in any way? I know you weren't.
No, as a matter of fact, I didn't know anything about it until after 2005.
Okay, really? Okay.
Because it was just one of the things that I was briefed on afterward. And,
okay.
After I had gone public, of course, I got mail from all over the world, and a lot of documents. Some of them have been highly classified, and a number of books, probably a couple of dozen books, I think all of which I've read, or most of which I've read. And Shag Harbor was one of the cases that a lot of people thought that I would be familiar with, but hadn't until I learned the facts later. And there was a couple of interesting things about that. This was considered to be a crash originally in the water, and the ship disappeared, and the United States Navy divers were involved in coming up and looking for it. And then the thing, whatever it was, disappeared, as you suggested, and it was never seen again. And I guess it was quite a revelation to a lot of people, including me, that they can travel at very high speeds underwater, as well as extraordinarily high speeds through the air and space.
Uh-huh.
So they're very versatile machines. When we say they, I'm talking specifically here about the one that landed or crashed at Shag Harbor, because there are, as you know, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, several species. And they don't all have the same kinds of chips. They may not all have the same kinds of capabilities. But certainly some of them, including that one, had an underwater capability because it disappeared totally. And despite the best efforts of the U.S. Navy, there was no sign of it on the bottom of the ocean there.
Okay. The next question is pretty much, you really pretty much answered that as far as American involvement with UFOs and your own contacts information-wise. I'm curious about back engineering. Can you Do you have any information about exactly what has been back-engineered? Certainly craft, I suppose, or how many kinds of craft, and what the results have been. And I know in Corso's book, he suggests that the information and the technology was fed slowly to a private industry. Do you have any information on that?
Well, I've had some people confirm that some of the things he mentions are true, that even though they were old ideas, that fiber optics, for example, was one. Microchips was probably one of the most important because it just revolutionized our communications technology totally. And there have been a number of discoveries that presumably were either due to the crash vehicles or were enhanced and speeded up the development. Lasers, for example, I'm told were underway, but I think they certainly took a big leap forward after they had a look at some of the laser applications from them.
All right. We have we have a question from a listener. Is the listener on the line, or is this just a written question? Just a written question, because this is from our caller. Was Mr. Hellyer familiar with Wilbur Smith, the Project Magnet, the head of Project Magnet in the 1950s?
I never met him and didn't really know anything about him until, again, after 2005. And I found out he worked in one of the departments that I headed. He worked in the Department of Transport. I became Minister of Transport, I guess, just about the time he resigned. Retired, I guess is the proper word. And so I have since seen his top secret memo. When I say top secret, it was top secret at the time. I think it's totally declassified now. Which he said that he was very interested. He was seeking permission from his boss to do some experiments in this area because his specialization was electromagnetics. And from what he knew about the craft, information he had gained from Washington, this is a certain parallel between the experiments that he and his section were doing and the characteristics of the ships that were reported to be coming to Earth. So he got some information through the Canadian Embassy in Washington to the effect that first, UFOs were real, period. There was no question about it. And that the subject was the most highly classified in the United States, even above that of the hydrogen bomb, which is right up the top there. This was above the top. And that they didn't use the word back engineering. Well, the United States was very interested in the subject, I guess is the third point. The fourth one was that they were already starting to look at the technology and find out what they could learn from it. And they had a group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, one of America's foremost scientists. And this was the way back, in the 1950s. So these efforts to duplicate or replicate the technology have been going on from that time at least forward. You have to wonder what can be accomplished in 60 years. One of the it's interesting, just as you were tuning in, Rhode Island was mentioned.
Really?
One of the alleged whistleblowers who worked in the facilities in Nevada and Arizona said that the underground facilities out there were about the size of Rhode Island, getting bigger all the time. Yeah,
Rhode Island is the standard size for a global measurement, I think.
Yeah. So I found that first mind-boggling. It's hard to believe, but there sure are a lot of underground facilities out there, not just one, but several, and they employ a lot of people and they consume a lot of tax dollars.
That's amazing.
I think they have accomplished a lot, but I'm not sure that all of it's good, because I think they've been developing some diabolical weapons.
Well, that's true. There are members of Congress who we know some, who have been questioning this and just get stonewalled.
Oh, exactly.
I'm sure the same thing happens everywhere. Well, we're going to take a commercial break, and we'll be right back on Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and onworldwide.com. And we'll continue our conversation with the Honorable Paul Hellyer. Okay.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
Hi, Rick Pickard here. The great sounds of rock and roll is back every Sunday from 1 to 4. Memory Lane will be playing songs from the 50s and early 60s. Be part of the great memories and sounds. See you there.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
And I just wanted to mention Amazon Kindle. Amazon.com is well known to everybody as a tremendous retailer of online books, DVDs, and all sorts of other things. And they have a marvelous e-reader, electronic book reader. You can just hold it in your hand and literally download books and magazines and newspapers from all over the place, coming up on 1 million of these, including 4 of my own books. And I just wanted to say that you should check it out. Any of the Amazon.com website certainly will give you information about the Amazon Kindle device. It's as low as $139, maybe lower now since our last information. And it's also being sold, I believe, at Staples as well, the office supply store. And it's a wonderful investment especially for the summer, as you sit on the beach or under the trees in the national parks of our great continent. You can certainly enjoy any book you'd like, pretty much anywhere, anytime, without the expense of these $4 a gallon trips to the bookstore or from having to buy the books. The books themselves are about half price or less than the actual retail copies of the printed editions. So check it out, Amazon Kindle. And I also wanted to mention something of extremely local interest here in the Blackstone Valley of New England. And usually in New England we have clam bakes, but here is an example of a pig pickin'. Now, if you're like me, I had to be if I were not married to a South Carolina belle, I would not know what a pig pickin' was, because you don't usually have those north of the Mason-Dixon line. But this is a pig pickin' barbecue at St. Michael's Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Southern style pig roast. And tickets are on sale now for this at the church in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, here where we broadcast from. The event will take place on Sunday, July 17th. And that's from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. It's next week. The pig pickin' is a significant part of the culture of the South, and the Senior Ukrainian Orthodox League at the church is presenting this cuisine to the Woonsocket community as a means of raising funds for their organization, dedicated to the church and devoted to the youth. Anyway, the menu will include pulled pork, Southwestern-style chili, cowboy beans, cornbread, coleslaw. I'm going to show up to see just what half this stuff is. Pastries, and there's an optional children's meal of a hot dog and beans. I know what that is. Anyway, reservations are limited to 200 attendees. Tickets are $20 a person for adults and $5 for children, 12 and under. And I know that's of strictly local interest, but hey, if you want to come from Los Angeles or Toronto or Nunavut or Florida or anywhere, they'd love to have you. So, again, check it out at www.stmichaeluoc.org, stmichaeluoc.org. Okay, very good. So let's get back to our guest, Mr. Hellyer. And I think, Ben, you have more questions?
Of course, I always have questions.
I have one that you just raised in the commercial. It's on the Kindle. And I saw my first one over this last weekend. My daughter-in-law has one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and of course she had to go look up my books.
Oh, that's a great idea. Look up Mr. Hellyer's books, too. Many books on public affairs.
We won't compete, but we're parallel.
Well, we're on the same team with the Kindle here.
And
so
one of my books, of course, you have mentioned already, was Light at the End of the Tunnel.
That's going to be the prize for our guest.
For the human species, and the other one is called A Miracle in Waiting, Economics of Common Sense. And boy, could your people in Congress ever use that today if they would just take time to read it.
Well, if they can read, not to be insulting to our Congress, but they're not held in very high esteem in this country at this point. Most of them.
A word about the light at the end of the tunnel. It has a long chapter in it about the extraterrestrial presence of technology, and it's sort of a primer. So if you have friends who are skeptics or agnostics, why this would be a good place for them to start.
Excellent.
Because I have included a lot of interviews that I've done with people who have been in the business, and they include interviews with people who have been abducted and who have brought back information, and who have brought back information that's important to the future of the world. Jim Sparks is one, for example, who has really been abducted more times than just about anybody. And I have a long quote in my book from him with advice from the extraterrestrials that he was talking to about what we should do to save our planet. And they're very concerned about what we're doing to our planet. They think that we're blowing it. And I don't usually plug my book so much because I'm not in the business of selling books. I've never broken even on one yet. But if you want to know what's going on in the world and who's pulling the strings and why so much has gone wrong and then what has to be done about it, My Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, is a good book for you to take either in its hard copy or soft copy form or by electronics. Either way, but it would be a good read if you really want to know what's going on in the world and why things are in such a mess today.
Very good. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. Of course, we disagree with you a little bit on being sure of the intentions of some of these, and we'll get into that later. But while we're on the subject of your books, why don't you tell us about the rest of them, because they're all very interesting and very valuable.
Well, most of my books are not in print. I wrote one called Damn the Torpedoes, which was my fight to unify the Canadian Armed Forces. And that's a very interesting book for anybody who wants to know how government works. And I guess the lesson from it is how difficult, bordering on impossible, it is to change anything that's significant in government. So, people can get elected and say they're going to do marvelous things. But when you start fighting the bureaucracy or the permanent government, as Lee Lapp, the editor of Harper's Magazine, says, you're fighting against formidable odds. And anybody that tries to run the United States is going to run into that kind of resistance, especially on the financial side, because Wall Street's been running your country for decades, and they're still running it, want to continue it that way. And as long as they are, well, heaven help you. That's all I can say.
Yeah, indeed. Certainly echo that. Okay, well, back to our questions then. Ben, take it away.
All right, so several of the United States Air Force people who experienced the Rendlesham Forest incidents in 1980 are convinced that these were travelers from the remote future and not space aliens. And could the real explanation of UFOs at least be that in some cases?
I know you've answered this on the other show, but we're going to repeat it for this audience.
Say that up again, because I sort of missed a little bit of it.
Okay, we repeated it.
Okay. So the people who were in the United States Air Force during the time of the Rendlesham Forest, who were there, the Rendlesham Forest incidents, so they believe that the UFOs were remote travelers from the remote future. So could aliens be travelers from the remote future and not space aliens at all?
Or some of them, at least.
Yeah.
Well, this is getting in pretty complicated stuff. I don't know, but Colonel Charles Halt, who was the deputy commander of the twin bases there, I interviewed him at great length, and I have his interview in my book. And I guess the important, well, there are a lot of important things about his interview. One, it sort of tells what people start out thinking. When he left the mess dinner, or at least the Christmas dinner, to go out and look for himself the second sighting, second or third or whatever it was, he said, I was going out to put an end to this nonsense once and for all. And of course it changed his life totally, as he has since said, and he was one of the people who was at this press conference that I alluded to in Washington not too long ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there was any doubt about the reality of the situation. I think what is questionable is how advanced some of their technology is, that they can change form. And other people who have witnessed abduction and so on have found that some of the species anyway can one minute look like something and the next minute look like something else. And the thing that blew my mind from the Rendlesham Forest case was that this one ship seemed to started giving off molten metal and then all of a sudden exploded into 5 light bulbs.
Mm-hmm.
And as Paula Harris says in one of her books, how do you talk to a light bulb? And
she never told us that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer. Furthermore, I don't know anybody else that does either.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, this brings us into such fascinating things.
Well,
we all know that light and energy are interchangeable.
Sure.
And so it shouldn't surprise us too much if there are advanced technologies where you can switch back and forth from one to the other.
Well, this leads us really right into my question, which is, and we got into this a bit on the last show, but if the technology of this kind is so bizarre, a solid object seeming to break into smaller ones, and what Halt described also to us as molten metal, looking like it was dripping from the craft, and all this things that they're just beyond our understanding technologically.
Absolutely.
Maybe the moral, ethical, spiritual, whatever standards of these people are just as far beyond us. I mean, are we sticking our necks out with movements such as the exopolitics movement? I know of which you are a supporter. And the exopolitics movement is the idea that cooperation, law, goodwill should extend beyond Earth to include these visitors, if that's what they are. In 40 years of working in other areas of the paranormal, I've learned not to trust these things. And I'm just curious why you feel that these aliens, if that's what they are, can be trusted.
Well, because I have no reason not to. I guess that's the substance of it. In our last broadcast, you raised the question of Dr. Hawkins.
Yes.
And I took exception to what he was saying, because he said some things that he wouldn't have said if he had been as knowledgeable as we all are.
Well, he also thinks God is a fairy tale. I think the problem is that Stephen Hawking thinks he's God, and maybe that's the problem.
He said, and I quote from a report from his documentary, that most of the extraterrestrials, if there were some, would be similar to microbes or small animals. But then he added that advanced life forms may be nomads, including looking to conquer and dominate new planets, to colonize them. And I guess my reaction was, first of all, if he was familiar with the species that are here, and there's some quite real differences between them. I think we discussed the tall whites on the previous show, did we?
I believe so, yes.
Well, they are so much like us that some of the women were able to go into Las Vegas and shop and not be recognized. And so there are great differences. But two things. One, I think spiritually they are more advanced than we are. This is the general trust of what I have been able to learn from reading all sorts of people, including Dr. John Mack, who was so deeply involved in talking to people who have been abducted and so on. And secondly, they could have taken us over anytime they wanted to, in the early 50s or 60s at least, maybe even now.
How do we know they didn't?
How did we know they didn't? Well, I don't know. I think because we're doing the same stupid things that we've been doing for decades. In the United States today, you just raised an interesting point. That the policy that the Congress is trying to ram down the throats of Americans today was exactly the same one that was done in the 1930 and 31 to 32 Depression. And will have exactly the same result.
You're right.
what they did then extended the Depression into 8 or 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're doing now will extend the recession depression, or whatever you want to call it, for far longer than it needs to go. And the only thing that bailed them out in the 1930s was a war.
Mm.
When government started borrowing more money like mad to fight the war. And this, of course, is part of what the international monetary cartel really likes. They love war because governments start spending money like crazy and borrowing it from the banks who make it created out of thin air and then have to pay it back with interest. So you've got all of this fantastic debt all over the world because practically all of the money is created as debt. And poor British, for example, they're still paying interest on the bonds that they took from the moneyed class at the time of the Revolutionary War in the United States.
Goodness, I didn't realize that.
At least you folks have had enough sense once, Lincoln, not to make the same mistake again, but then you reverted right back, adopted the British system, and have run up this fantastic debt, none of which was really necessary.
Yeah.
It was simply because your Congress sold you out to the Federal Reserve System 9 years ago, and you've been suffering the consequences ever since.
Well, the question might arise, leading us right back from the economy into the alien. If this alien presence is real and relatively pervasive in certain circles, is there a connection between the mess we're in and the aliens, either from the viewpoint of them causing it or them being able to help? And I'm talking also about global warming, which you mentioned in your book.
Well, I don't think so, but if you want to get into the spiritual aspect of things, that there's no doubt in my mind, and I certainly state this in the book, that there are forces of good and evil that extend far beyond the boundaries of Earth. And so we can be getting advice, as we do, from voices that can tell us to do good things or tell us to do bad things. And, take a guy like Hitler, for example. The people he listened to, the voices that he listened to, told him to do some absolutely horrendously horrible things. And other people that I know who are going out giving food aid to the refugees and doing operations on people's eyes and so on for free and trying to do good in the world, trying to do right. You can use the word righteousness if you want to, because that's just doing right. But there are people who are doing right, and there are people who are doing wrong. And if you want to say, well, these influences come from outside of from the planet, I wouldn't want to argue with that, because I think we're getting both messages, and the question is which wave band you tune in on.
Yes. That's a problem we all have, I'm afraid. How to interpret, various messages from various directions saying different things. It's part of the human conundrum, I think. Now, I just wanted to. You yourself have had a UFO experience, if only once. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, saw my first one last October, and just from the driveway outside of the building I'm sitting in. It was a October night, and my wife went out in the patio to take a look at the stars and couldn't see anything because of the trees, or it's a wooded area. And then she went out the other way to the driveway, and for some reason or other, just to be sociable, I guess, I put on my hat and followed her out. She looked up in the western sky and said, "Oh, there's a star." I looked up, and there it was. For some reason, I turned around and I said, looked to the east. I said, "Hey, there's one over here that's far, far brighter. Take a look." And that began 20 minutes of nearly breaking our necks looking up at this thing, which would change position in the sky 2 or 3 degrees in as many seconds. And we started eliminating things. Is it a star? No. Is it a satellite? No, is it the space station going by? No, because it goes by much faster than that. I checked that out after I got back to Toronto, the estimation. And it couldn't have been anything but a UFO, which is not surprising because in my book I have a picture of one that was taken from our dock, just 200 yards away, about 2 years ago, I guess. And then there was a sighting here at our place about 15 years ago, and some of it we used to operate it as the little tourist resort. And about a dozen of our guests were having a bonfire out on the lakeside. And they saw this thing zooming around the southern side of the lake and reported it in the morning. And 2 or 3 of them, I think, had been tasting a little bit of Jack Daniels. And so there was a fair amount of skepticism. But there were 3 people of the people who were there, 3 of them, probably 9 or 10, who didn't drink a single thing, absolutely, totally. They saw exactly the same thing. They said there was something. And they described how it moved the same way as the one I described that we saw last October.
Okay.
So there was a landing not far, about 10 miles from here. That
a landing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The lake you referred to, was that Lake Ontario?
Oh, this is Lake Muskoka.
Oh, all right. I know where that is.
It's about 120 miles north of Toronto, Lake Ontario. Yeah. And there have been a lot of sightings up here. There's a little lake called Skeleton Lake just north of the Muskoka Lakes. And the person I know in Toronto, whom I rent my office space, says they see UFOs in the sky all the time.
Okay, well, there is one question that kind of bothers us a lot. Go ahead, Ben.
All right, so if aliens have good intentions, why the abduction phenomena and ruined people they ruined people's lives as a result?
Well, you know the rumors, and I suspect they may be true, that there was some sort of a treaty between the United States and one of the species. And what we don't know until we get full disclosure is whether that treaty authorizes a certain number of abductions, and if so, how many. And the theory is that this one species had been engaged in genetic engineering to the point where they had nearly genetically engineered themselves out of existence, and they had to look for some new genetic material, and that's one of the reasons that they were here and looking to exchange technology for that particular thing that they needed very desperately for continuation of their own species.
That's the implication there is, I mean, obviously, individuals of different species cannot mate unless they are very, very similar, DNA-wise. So the implication here is that these people are very, very similar to us. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I'm not a geneticist, so I can't say, but I do know that allegedly they have managed to create a hybrid species.
Why?
Well, I guess to continue their...
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And going back to Hebert Smith and the contacts that they had back then, they got the distinct impression that the visitors were here to help us, to teach us a better way of doing things, to revolutionize our way of doing things, so that we would abandon wars, fighting and killing each other and all that sort of thing, and have more of a heaven on earth. And Hebert Smith was intrigued and wrote some beautiful things as to what he thought was possible if we would listen. And my concern, I guess, and this is just one more reason why I think Congress has got to demand full disclosure, and the sooner the better. My concern is that we haven't been listening to the people who really wanted to help us. And we're going to have to stop shooting them down and trying to, and start listening and taking advantage of what they have to teach us, particularly in the realm of medicine, for example, and agriculture, which is becoming a problem on Earth with all the people we've got to feed. And there are better ways of doing things, and they're available to us if we would just cooperate instead of
this theme extends throughout the entire history of the human race. If you listen to certain writers, but there's the sort of the Prometheus syndrome, I suppose you might call it, where some benign visitor gives us fire, instead of warming ourselves, we go burn down the enemy's village or something.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was a benign being that gave us atomic bombs or not, but I know visitors are really...
Yeah. There seems to be a double-edged sword here. That's all we're saying.
Absolutely. There's always the good and evil. You can use the stuff for positive purposes, or you can use it to destroy the world.
Now, you mentioned a treaty. Do you have any evidence between us and them, so to speak? Do you have any real evidence this treaty exists?
No, but I've heard it from so many people, different walks of life, that I don't discount the possibility that it exists.
Well, if they were to violate the treaty, who's going to stop them?
Well, let me put it the other way around. Allegedly, you have violated the treaty because it involved a disclosure clause, and this was not lived up to.
So we're in trouble.
Well, if you're...
We have enough strange things that happen in relation to these shows. But we'll keep you posted on that. Okay.
I have some things to say in my book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, Survival Plan for the Human Species, about how we've been killing each other for fighting for a long time, and suggesting that that's a good area that we're going to have to clean up our act on, too.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've, again, as we always do, open up tremendous areas here for further discussion, but there are all sorts of ideas on why aliens would try to help. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. I've heard one that says that they messed with our genetics eons ago and feel guilty about the result, all the way to wanting to save us from ourselves just to protect the galactic neighborhood. And I'm sure you know Stan Friedman. And Stan believes that they have been watching and attempting to prevent us from taking our warlike tendencies out into the galaxy. What's your opinion on that? Is it just the genetic thing, as you mentioned, or is there more to their reputed good intentions?
Well, I think it's that's just a small part of it. I think that they're, for the most part, that the species are benign. And if there's one that isn't, then I would like the people who are in the loop to tell us who it is and why they have come to that conclusion. Because I've never heard of a case where the visitors have shot first. It's always been the other way around. With our warlike tendencies, why we've tried to shoot them down from day one.
Yeah.
And so I just think the time has come when we Earthlings are going to have to learn from others and change our ways in order to save our own planet and our own future for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time here. It is. You are a wonderful guest. It's always a pleasure. And why don't you tell everyone about your website?
Yeah, and one that I haven't told them about, www.victoryfortheworld.net. That's the website I'd like you to go to.
Oh, sure, okay.
You can download the speech I made in Arizona in February, which I would recommend to you.
Mm-hmm.
You can get some good ideas for books. And there are action plans for Canada, the United States, and the world. And if you want to help do something to save your country and to change the system and not to have to worry about the debt, whether it's going to get bigger or not,
yeah.
Go to www.victoryfortheworld.net and start off from there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and I'm sure we're going to continue our discussion on future shows, and good luck, and
Thanks
God bless.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All the best.
Okay. Now, I just very quickly wanted to mention an email that we received, and just as an example of what you should not do. All right. This is someone who writes fascinatingly that he's had a lot of strange experiences at certain points, and he has captured some of these on a digital camera. Wanted to know if he'd like to send them to us to look at. We'd love to see those. But this person does not mention his or her name, where he or she is from, and does not put an email. This is on the form on behindtheparanormal.com by which you can ask questions. So we certainly would ask, please, when you submit the form, please do not forget to put at least your name. You don't have to put where you're from, but we like to know at least the city, state, province, whatever, country even, and the email address at which you can be reached, because otherwise we don't even know how to respond to this. So whoever wrote this, if you're listening, please by all means send us this material and send us your contact information. So in the meantime, thanks to our producer, Steve Bianchi, and we'll see you right here on Monday, July 18th, when we welcome paranormal researcher Dale Kaczmarek, who will discuss his ideas on dealing with ghosts.
All right, in the meantime, tune into our CBS radio edition in Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Seattle online at www.newskyradio.com and on your iPhone with the AOL Radio app on Sunday, July 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific, when my dad and I will have an open line show to catch up on our ever-growing stack of emails. And remember, you can always get free podcasts of all our shows, along with show schedules and guest information at www.behindtheparanormal.com.
And we leave you with a word from Major Donald E. Kehoe of the United States Marine Corps from 1953. Quote, "With control of the universe at stake, a crash program is imperative. We produced the A-bomb under the huge Manhattan Project in an amazingly short time. The needs, the urgency today are even greater."
All right, so thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we'll see you next time.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.